I I have a belief, and this is just, well, let me start differently. We're in an enormous transition period between the materialistic age of Kali Yuga and the rising age of energy, Dwapara Yuga. This is the Indian way of describing it. You don't have to have any context. You just have to have eyes to see and ears to hear to see that everything is changing, and everything is changing so fast that whereas for most of the generations before us, there was a certain reliability about just even fundamental social systems. I mean, speaking from the last 100 years, it's really begun to shift. But therefore, what happens to all of us as individuals is that we are able to live so many different lifetimes in a very short span of time because change is so accessible and change is constantly being imposed upon us. I mean, I think of small things like there was this Indian family, as it were, who ran a little shop where they developed film. And they were immigrants and they'd established themselves well. They ran a really nice business. Of course, it's totally evaporated. It's just absolutely gone because nobody uses film in a camera anymore. They all now, everything is digital. So their whole business just disappeared. I was reading about a breakthrough in artificial intelligence that would allow cancer cells to be perceived, that the computer would look at the slide sample instead of the human being looking at the slide sample. You know, a whole nother trained profession just goes out the window. People have their life all planned, and then pretty soon it's gone. And then we also get exposed to things that we would never have been exposed to. I don't mean inoculated or infected.
Right.
We have the opportunity to travel, to consider professions that were never there, to be on the front end of something completely new that's developing. Businesses are global, travel is so simple, all of which puts an extraordinary strain on human relationships, just unprecedented strain. So it's like the karma of several generations here, in which all the normal supportive realities for human relationships and human love have basically been stripped away. They've just been completely taken off the table. And yet we haven't changed. We still have the same basic needs and the same basic desires, but it's like a high wire act. You know, it used to be that you lived in the same town, you had the same friends, you had your generational family. And because we're talking about a primary partnership, a love partnership, it only very recently did that love partnership have to bear the burden virtually of our entire need for human intimacy. Before, it's like your husband or your wife was in the context of your mother, your father, your aunts, your uncles, your siblings, your nieces, your nephews. And so that relationship could give you what it could give you, but it didn't break because it couldn't give you everything. So an enormous amount of the problem, I think, is that we are asking of these intimate love relationships something that is very, very rare and very hard to come by, which is a level of capacity to fulfill each other's emotional needs that is very hard for any two people to do for each other. So there's about 100 strikes against us before we begin. Also, we don't have a very sacred attitude towards sexuality anymore, and that's putting it mildly. We have a very self-indulgent attitude or self-fulfillment attitude. Now, everything I say that's a limitation, it's also a plus. I'm describing these conditions, but I'm not necessarily saying that they're a step down. They just are the reality that we're working with, and we haven't really adjusted to that reality. Sexuality is easily accessible to most adults, not, not prostitutes, not, you don't have to demean yourself. It's just sexual partnerships are just part of the story. So that was a huge incentive to hold relationships together. I have a very realistic attitude about the importance of sexuality in intimate relationships, and that used to be a unique feature that would also hold people together. That is also, it's still, of course, part of the story, but conditions under which sexual fulfillment is possible are, again, all the walls are down. And so everybody can go everywhere. Plus, on the other side of it, our whole society is so sexualized that the understanding of the balanced role of sexuality in adult relationships, it's very confused. It's exceedingly distorted. And sexuality comes in very early, before people even know each other. Then they get to know each other, and there's this sense of great exposure and intimacy, but you're really still working with a stranger because it takes a long time. Again, all of these things are enormous impersonal challenges that we're all having to work with. And nonetheless, even from a spiritual point of view, especially from a spiritual point of view, we must learn to be unselfish. That's what spirituality is that we are able to be generous with our own needs in order to help other people grow in the way that they need to grow. I don't mean that we should be inappropriately generous, but we need to learn how to love. And love is more about giving in a balanced way than it is about keeping score and making sure I'm getting what I want. And we tend to be very afraid of those lessons. So we're made in such a way that we desire partnership, we desire children, and all of those things force us to expand our sense of the possible. And when everything goes right, which is not always by any means, we get to grow. So it's still required, but we have to catch up to the realities of what we're dealing with. And I mean, we have to add also the fact that women are not dependent on men. When we're dealing with heterosexual relationships, women are not dependent on men. And therefore, everybody has to step up to the plate in ways that we really don't know. And nobody can teach us. So it's pretty much of a chaos zone right now, is what I've seen. And there's no stigma on divorce. So that's the good news, and that's the bad news. The good news about that is you don't get wrapped up in something for your whole life that is of zero benefit to you on any level. A person can simply walk away, and that's the good news. The bad news is it takes a lot more time and a lot more effort to really build a deep relationship. And when the door is always half open, many times it's just easier to walk away from it. And so we're also not compelled to grow sometimes. We grow in other ways for other reasons, but we don't have to stick it out in the way that people did before. Now, a lot of times sticking it out, as I say, was just as often bad as good. Every single thing I'm saying has two sides to it. But what I'm saying is, let's not take this personally. That we are in a maelstrom of confusion, and we're a transition generations here. And these transition generations are going to have to suffer a lot until we figure it out. Swami Kriyananda said to me once, we have to raise the children completely with a completely different understanding. He says it takes several generations to straighten it out, because we haven't even begun to raise the children with a deeper understanding of themselves, of their place in the world, how to work with energy, of where sex comes into it, of how to truly love. We're just teaching children to get high test scores and get high-paying jobs. I mean, how much energy, think about it. We give just zero energy to really teaching young people the values that will make the difference when they become adults. I mean, this is the big joke about education, that adults realize that their happiness comes from sources that were never, ever, ever mentioned in all of their years of education. Like, this is kind of dumb. And especially, since we're having to reinvent this, we're having to re-explore, recreate, come to peace with all of these changing realities. Men and women, especially, and gay relationships are a whole nother story about which I know less, but everybody's just having to figure out, who are we? Where do we belong? And that's the good news. Because it's all about personal growth and all about personal responsibility. It's all about self-understanding. It's not about just getting our comfortable niche and settling down into it, and you have to behave this way and I behave this way. We're not necessarily happy, but at least we're not broken and afraid. But that's not necessarily a good life. It's just a life in which there's no change. So, having said all of that, we just have to start over. We have to start over. What am I looking for? What do I need? Where does it fit? And in this particular age, I think we have to be satisfied with realizing we're not going to, much of what we want out of life is not going to come, because it's just like that. So we have to learn whatever it is that God is trying to teach us with what the circumstances. The fundamental problem, and I'll skip right to the end, is that we don't see ourselves as part of a greater reality. And we don't understand that our lives are really being guided from superconscious divinity. And that balancing line between what I think I need, how I focus my mind to achieve it, and surrender to the fact that there are forces acting on my life from a higher plane that I might not even understand. So everything that comes to me is for my own greater good. How do I really apply that, to friendship, to love relationships? All I've done is outline the problems, of course. I haven't said anything about solutions, but that's a whole big other story. But whenever somebody comes and talks to me about struggles they have in relationships, I say, well, welcome to this plane at this time. I think it'll get better, but I don't know if it'll get better. Better meaning, well, it's so confusing to me. I know so many single people who are so longing for a loving relationship. And it seems like they could match themselves up more easily. Yeah, you would just think they could, but they don't. It doesn't seem to be in the cards for it to happen. Not that it won't happen, but that it's not as clear cut as it has been in other times, where your parents would arrange what would much of the time be a wonderful life for you, but then you'd live that life in the context of your whole family. Right. So what you needed from your partner was very different.
Yeah.
It's the best I could say.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. All that actually makes a lot of sense. Actually, yeah, I can see all those pieces fitting together in the greater landscape. Is it easier when we're younger, or we're just less aware, and so we rush into things? Or is it really just the state of where life is right now? But a lot of people say that to me. Why do I have to do all this inner work? It's like when I was younger, I just meet somebody and we'd get together and it would,
Yeah, but then of course, are they still with that person, and how did it
No.
work? Yeah, so you could have lots of experiences. My own point of view is that the sexual drive is so powerful when you're younger, and as I've said, the walls are down. So you can have a lot more relationships that will last a while, and that usually sexual energy will hold you together for a long time. And then as you get to know each other on a deeper level, you may find great incompatibilities that were balanced, by the physical attraction. Um, I think you have people, I think in this age, and it's, as I say, it stretches over a number of generations. my One of my informal things is that everybody has a quota of misery that they just have to go through, you know? And you're going to get it one way or another. You're going to get it because you are married. You're going to get it because you're not married. You're going to, because you have children, or you're going to get it because you don't have children. And you can just go down that list. But there's going to be a quota of misery that will wake you up to deeper realities and deeper powers within yourself. And for some reason, most of us don't learn unless we hurt. Hurt is a tremendous motivator. Yeah, yeah. So one way or another, that hurt comes to us. And when that hurt comes to us, it forces us to think more deeply. I think it's a terrible system. Apparently, Yogananda thought it was a terrible system. He prayed, Divine Mother, why must you teach your children through suffering? If we're open-minded, most of us are willing to say that the hardest times taught us the most important lessons. And I wish I didn't have to say that. I would prefer not to have to say that, but I do. I don't like it. I'm with Yogananda. I heartily disapprove. I think when we're younger, we have no sense of time or consequences. We often have no responsibilities. We have no children. We have no mortgages, whatever. So who cares? Let's just have adventures. You get older, you recognize the pattern faster. You know where this is going. So you will stop sooner. I think that both of them have their charm.
Yeah.
Although I did recently say to a friend of mine who is the age of, if I had grandchildren, he would be a grandchild. And I said, well, I talked to him just like a peer. He's a very good friend. I said, well, at least we're not 25 anymore. He looked at me and he said, well, technically, no, I'm actually 26. He said, and I actually said, these words came out of my mouth. Oh, you poor sap, it's all in front of you. But I wouldn't trade it, everything that I've been through in my life. It's all been really wonderful. And some of the days were hard, but it's still been wonderful. So that's a victorious life. We think a snugly happy one, comfortable, unchallenged. But in the end, I don't think that's true. Now, that doesn't preclude having a really good friend, a really close, intimate friend. And we often do have that, at least for a period of time. But everything changes so fast these days that people become something that they're not anymore, that they didn't used to be. That was what I've had to see at different times. The people who had that relationship, neither of them exist anymore. Too many things have happened. And so those two people who are very happy together, those people aren't anywhere on the planet now because their consciousness has shifted. And nobody did anything to anybody. It's just time and circumstances made everybody into someone else. And it's heartbreaking. But there you have it. Yeah. I mean, it used to be you couldn't even meet anyone who didn't live in your village, that your whole village didn't know, that everybody could vouch for, whose character you'd known since they were a baby. Now you go on the internet, you meet somebody on the other side of the world. Right. And then all the complexities of all of that step in. Sometimes you're deceived, sometimes you're not. Sometimes a person is exactly who they seem to be, but you've met each other over huge time and space at stages of your life where you have other commitments and it's just very hard to fit this in. It's nobody's fault. It's just one more obstacle.
Mhm.